Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. My name is Lisa Jarrett. I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors of KSMoCA, the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. School Museum of Contemporary Art. We are a contemporary art museum inside Dr. MLK Jr. School here in Northeast Portland, Oregon. I am joined today by my colleague, co-founder and co-director Harold Fletcher, and by Amanda Lee Evans, who is one of our program directors and primary collaborators. Thanks to everybody for being here today, and a very warm welcome to our Dr. MLK Jr. School students joining us on our YouTube live stream and channel. Students, if you have any questions for our talk today, please feel free to put them in the chat on YouTube, and we will make sure to get those questions to our speaker this morning. I want to also make sure to thank everybody at the school that supports this work and makes all of this operating functional possible, all of the work that happens from the school side. Principal Jill Sage, thank you so much. Paige Thomas, Nancy Rios, Michelle Peak. We couldn't do this work without you. If I forgot anybody, I think Mo will help me out there. So we're gonna just have a really great surprise guest speaker today. This will be our second opportunity to hear from Akasha Lawrence Spence. And I think it'd be really nice to hear from Mo a little bit more about Akasha before we move into the talk. Mo?
You forgot about Miss Moog, Miss Tran, Huang Lao Shi, Gao Lao Shi, Ling Lao Shi.
I forgot so many people. Thank you, Mo, and thank you to everybody that I forgot. Mo, can you tell us a little bit about our speaker today?
Yes, I can.
Great.
Okay. By the way, it's a very special day for Akasha. Go check out her speech. It's maybe on YouTube. I don't know. Hi, I'm Mo. I go to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. School, and I'm the head photographer for KSMoCA. I'm also introducing the artist for this lecture series. Lisa always forgets Mr. Monty. So I'm going to say, hi, Mr. Monty. Thank you. Today we have a special guest back for her second talk. Her name is Akasha Lawrence Spence. Akasha is a Black Caribbean American woman who represented Southwest Portland in the Oregon State Legislature in 2020. She is the founder and principal designer of the Fifth Element. The fifth element is love. That's what the fifth element is.
It's true.
And the founder of Melanated. That's a very good name. Now Akasha is running for the people candidate for Oregon Senate District 18. It's very exciting to learn about this. Her work is focused on financial empowerment, entrepreneurship, civic engagement, and community stewardship for our communities. Welcome, Akasha. Thank you for being here today. I sound like such a convincing therapist.
We all need therapy, Mo. Mental health is a really pertinent issue and things that people need to ensure that they have access to. And it's kind of a really good segue for what I'm going to talk about today. Thank you, KSMoCA, for having me, and Mo for the introduction. I appreciate you all for being here this morning. So I'm going to start to share my screen, and we're going to jump right into the talk. So today's talk is going to be about the architecture of grief and mourning. We know even just yesterday, a number of Americans lost their lives in a mass shooting at a plant in San Jose. The day before, we reached the 1-year mark of the murder of George Floyd. And what all of these things bring to bear and bring to light is that there's a lot of grief that is happening in our country and in our state and in our nation, a collective grieving of lives taken away too soon and gun violence. police brutality and the loss of security and the loss of safety for communities of color. Thinking about George Floyd yesterday and the day before, I know there were a lot of marches and a lot of speeches, and community members were trying to figure out, and electeds were trying to figure out how to hold space for the grief that we are carrying, not just for George Floyd, but for the countless Black and Brown Americans who have lost their lives to state violence. And when I talk about state violence, I'm not just talking about police brutality, but we're also talking about an inept response to COVID-19 that disproportionately impacted Black and Brown Americans.
Yes.
We're looking at the fact that so many of our brothers and sisters passed away because there wasn't a rapid response to health and safety under the leadership of our past he who shall not be named, that administration, and their laissez-faire attitude to a global health pandemic. And we, our communities, as usual, bear the brunt and the costs of that lack of action and that ineptitude. And so when we think about all of those names and faces and people who we've lost in our city and across our country, we're looking at the ways in which community members carve out space to grieve and mourn and to recognize those lives lost. We're all very familiar with murals and how quickly they pop up. But how do we navigate lasting space for collective grief and mourning? We know that some of these murals were on cardboard planks that were put up to protect businesses. So what happens when they come down? Where do they go? Some of these are on walls. What happens when the weather and the elements start to fade these pieces and this art? Is this enough? Is this enough to remember, the lives lost, and to also implant in the public consciousness the perpetual urgency to affirm Black lives? Is this enough? And how can the built environment create space for us to collectively grieve and for communities of color to find places and spaces of meaning to grieve and mourn? It made me think about the national and international spaces that we use to memorialize lives lost. The top photo is of the Vietnam Memorial. On the bottom left is the World Trade Center Memorial. That photo to the right of it is the Holocaust, or it's the memorial for murdered Jews in Europe that exists in Berlin. And these structures are made of stone. They are, dominant, and they take up space in the built environment. These were projects they put out the RFP, the call for artists, and they said, how can we best remember these folks? How can we best remember the significance of what happened to our city, or to these people, this ethnic minority, or to our soldiers who we sent over to war? What does it mean to craft out these spaces? What does it mean to have this be a tourist attraction, right? To have this be, I've been to all of these memorials. I'm originally from New York, and when 9/11 happened, I was in 8th grade, and I watched the second plane hit before they announced it from my classroom window. And there was a lot of grieving and mourning for the city around that time. There was a somber attitude. People were extra nice to each other. People went out of their way to do special things for each other. But what happens when it feels like the grief and mourning is specific to a marginalized group of people, right? That has not seen a reckoning akin to other groups, right? Who has not been able to have these spaces carved out for them in the same way, and have the reverence in real time that is necessary to really unpack what communities are feeling. There are no shortage of articles of what the mental toll that it takes on communities of color when you are witnessing and seeing videos over and over again of people who look like you being murdered and have to show up for work the next day or the same morning and have to perform, and do these things. How are we saying that, yes, these larger spaces are important, but how do we hold space for things that are actively occurring, right? Like I will talk about the memorial in Berlin. They were trying to build this memorial since the 80s, the 1980s. It did not start construction until 2005. The atrocity happened in the 1940s. So sometimes when we are looking at, creating these larger monuments that people can visit and come to, they're taking such a long time that how do we do something in the interim? How do we create space for community right now? I looked at, different ways in which people who have passed on and different cultures have chosen to look at the architecture. I want to go back a little bit to talk about this contrast. So when we look at the architecture of these monuments and of these memorial sites, again, they're made of stone. They're really heavy. The colors are darker. They're kind of, they don't feel intimate to me. They feel more like, trying to get you to have this somber tone. The colors connote this somber tone. The water cascading down into this void creates this kind of feeling of emptiness or longing, or, it kind of extends and prolongs the grief. In other cultures, you have the Taj Mahal, which is one of the most famous burial sites. It's a mausoleum for the wife of a king who died in childbirth. And so he constructed this mausoleum in her honor. And it's gorgeous. The architecture is more rounded. The brick is a lighter tone. The grounds are green and alive. And there's water that is still and reflecting the beauty of that architecture. And people can look into that water and see themselves reflected back. On the right, you see another structure. This structure exists in Iraq, and it is a structure that housed some of their shahs who have died. And so you look at the architecture here, and again, it's very bright and vibrant. It has a lot of texture and color, and they're using a lot of pattern. They're using geometry to really create some multidimensionality, as well as bringing you floral patterns that reflect nature and the life cycle, the fact that, we are all born of the same elements, right? The same elements that exist in this planet exist in our bodies, and we return to the earth when we die. And so I kept thinking about, well, what would it mean and what would it look like to, when I experience grief, right? How do I process my own grief? I live really close to Forest Park and the Rose Gardens and Washington Park. And so for me, much of what I do when I am down or in a state of grief and mourning, I escape to nature. I take a hike. I look into, to kind of, before we hopped on, we went live, Mo was talking about finding a meditative space, right? When you're under stress or anxiety, or you're experiencing something that feels insurmountable, where do you find refuge? And for me, being here and living in the environment that we do, having Portland here, and the the accessibility of nature makes it easy for me to find refuge in these spaces. I personally lost my mother quite suddenly 3 years ago, almost 4, it's 2021, so almost 4 years ago. And I had to go to New York, where I was originally from, to deal with that, right? And to confront all that was there. And being able to come back home to Portland and to Oregon, to these expansive green spaces, enabled me to really find solace and to think about what would it mean to create spaces like this specifically for the onslaught of events that create tremendous grief in communities of color, tremendous grief in our communities at large. So I started to think about what would it look like to craft a space that is for communities of color. What would it look like to craft a space that provides prospect and refuge, but is also green, but it's also a place where you can commune with other people and be restful, but also has murals and art that is enlivened and maybe refreshing and coming in and out, or is static? Or what would it look like to have a Zen garden or something that you can walk through and feel solace and feel comforted? And so I I struggle with these online lectures because I wish we could do this exercise together of finding these images and figuring out what it would look like to create a space for our community when we are grieving. What would it look like to, what are the elements that we would like to see? How do we build this into the spaces that already exist? How do we hold space for communities to go through the grief process that we so frequently have to go through? And then how do we move from that space, knowing that we need that, but how do we move from that space to policy work, to civic engagement, to ensuring that we have laws that prevent gun violence, to ensuring that we have social justice and racial justice warriors in our legislatures, on our city councils? How do we bridge that gap between feeling and emotion and action and policy? Part of that work is to hold space for community to ask, well, what does that space for grief and mourning look like? And how do we, again, bridge that gap? I wish I could get feedback now. Maybe I can. I'll just disrupt the process a little bit, if that's okay with you, Lisa. I would like to have maybe the students that are on maybe talk through this a little bit, because I think part of our processing with grief and mourning is to know that you're not doing it alone, and to come together to have the conversation around what this would look like. So I'm kind of going to disrupt your process a little bit and invite student participation at this point and before we move on.
That sounds fantastic, Akasha. Students, if you wouldn't mind coming on screen for a second and considering some of this question that Akasha is presenting to us in real time. And I think it's a really lovely opportunity, Akasha. Can you just speak the question to the group?
Yeah, so the question again is, given somebody needs to mute. Given the gravity of the grief and mourning that we've experienced, just even thinking back to 2020, right? With the movement for Black lives and that reckoning around the taking of Black men, women, and children through mechanisms of state violence, whether that's police brutality or COVID-19, the inept response to COVID-19 that disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities. How do we move to create spaces for our communities to grieve and mourn and do that in a collective and healthy manner that is not just, you know, a march, but someplace where you can continuously go back to, someplace that is healing and therapeutic. And then how do we bridge that gap from wanting to have that space to creating policy and tasking our electeds and our communities with becoming civically engaged to a place where we won't have to need those spaces again, right? Because part of the reason why we continuously are caught in this cycle is because policies aren't changing, right? We're not confronting, you know, the true nature of why people are being taken from us continuously, whether it's through, again, police brutality or inept responses to healthcare or, you know, a global pandemic or poverty or food insecurity or whatever it might be, to, you know, changing those policies. So how do we get from needing that collective space to actually changing the conversation and not having to need it at all?
A beautiful and very important question. I see a lot of nodding in the room from the PSU undergraduate students. What are some things that are coming up for you right now? And you may not be able to answer or address the question, right?
Yeah, it's not to say that you have the solution, because it's about community coming together with like, I feel like this might help and I feel like that might help, and all of us coming together with our collective solutions to craft the part of the solution.
Or even, I love the question of what does a space look like? What space of both mourning, recognition, honoring, and celebrating potentially look like for you? Nicholas, I saw you come off mute. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just thinking maybe just a space where it's open for many different things at many different times, where people can come there and it's not just for a certain kind of place and just for a certain kind of thing. It's like a place where just like everybody can come and really just like make their own choices and kind of just feel comfortable in that space as well. Kind of how you talked about too. I think like a space like in the city too, especially just in Portland, where like we can really come together and it's really just open and like can have large amounts of people, especially just with the marches just going through, and then like just like a meeting place where it's just like every week you like know you can go back to it and it's always going to be that same kind of place. It just like stays there and is kind of just like grounded too. In that way, I feel like there's not really a space in the city that is really grounded that you can go back to all the time. It always switches to a different location where people are feeling comfortable at. So I feel like we need a space, especially in Portland, that can act like that.
I feel like seeing all those examples of different types of memorials that you showed, like a lot of these are very somber places that like you visit and pay your respects, but you don't really spend time there. And so, yeah, I was thinking a lot along the lines of what Nicholas was saying, that making it like a truly community space where it's like a thing where people are actively participating and, you know, creating new things, not just like, oh, that thing that happened was so sad, now we're going to leave, you know. So things that come to mind for me are like, you know, a community garden or something where people are actually like creating something new and nurturing something, and you can see those changes over time. But also something that comes to mind when you talk about creating that kind of political change, I think that one of the big obstacles toward having community events where you can really gather people and make that kind of change is that honestly, just like renting space to meet can be expensive. That can be really cost prohibitive for grassroots groups. So creating a space where people could, you know, like reserve the area to have a meeting, but they don't necessarily have to pay a bunch of money. Like things like that, I think could be really helpful for that kind of community building that you're talking about. And I don't necessarily know exactly what that would look like, but I think that those are the kinds of considerations that I would be thinking of, you know, as I'm creating something like this. but yeah, it's just, it's so much, and you're giving me so much to think about right now. I don't necessarily have a lot of answers, but I'm just, I'm going to be chewing on this for a while.
Any other thoughts from the group? Thank you, Orion and Nicholas. Jam, did you have anything you were thinking about? You look contemplative at the moment.
I just wanted to throw something in there that might be interesting to consider. Is in the case of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. School, it was renamed in 1968. So it used to be a different school and a different name. And by changing the name, it changed sort of the way we think about the school. Similarly with Martin Luther King Boulevard, Cesar Chavez Boulevard, these are all things that were one, they existed before with different names. And then by renaming them, they actually sort of changed the way we think about the space. So I was wondering if that was a possibility also. It's just sort of thinking about the potential of renaming and sort of giving a different context to something that already exists. Like, could an existing park be renamed and resituated to be understood to do some of these things that Akasha is talking about? Just a thought.
Yeah, thanks.
No, I love that, Harold. And I want to make sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Orion, I think it is. And Nicholas, you all made really great points. And I think what Orion is talking about was something that I've encountered, and I'm gonna get back to the slideshow in a second. But something that I've encountered is, like you said, when groups in our city try to access spaces and create spaces for healing, it's expensive. I myself am working with a group of Black artists, and I could get back to the presentation if you want, but I kind of love to be in conversation and see people. So I've been working with a group of Black artists since November on a project to try to save the boards that were up around downtown Portland last year. And we've encountered some really intractable processes that already exist, including, people wanting artists to sign contracts to sign over their VARA rights, right? And so that they, and so for folks who don't know what VARA rights are, it's what would protect an artist from any other entity utilizing their copyright or moving their art or doing whatever it takes, whatever they want with their art without that artist's consent. We've also encountered, we are going to be hosting an event this Sunday, May 30th in Peninsula Park. And the permit fees that exist to host an event in the park are upwards of $4,000. You have to get that park permit, that is $3,000. You have to get the health code permit if you want to serve food. You have to get all of these permits that are incredibly cost prohibitive for people who are just trying to hold space for their community and who don't have access to resources. So it becomes one of these things where when we talk about equitable grief, right? Equitable public grief and collective grief spaces, how are we facilitating that? Or how are the institutions that exist preventing that from happening? How are they, the mechanisms that are already in place prohibitive to communities holding space for one another, right? Because they could show up without anything, but then you run the threat of having somebody call the police, and then that becomes another interaction. So you go about it trying to do the right thing, trying to go through the processes, and then you confront these costs, and then you're trying to get the city to cover them, and you should waive it and do these things. And I will commend the city of Portland for, they have, and I hope all of you artists on the call tap into this, but they have this grant that is anywhere from $2,500 to $5,000. If you can create spaces for healing, and I'll put the slideshow up in a second because it has it on there. But if you create spaces for healing in your community, they have this grant that you can access, and it could help you to do the events that our community so desperately needs, and hold space for us in the ways that we need space held for us. So I'm gonna try to share my screen again, and then give me a second. And I want to thank you guys for rolling with that and you know, being flexible. Okay. It should. Can you guys see it? No. Okay.
Not yet.
Okay. Oh, I wanted to talk, oh, let me go to present. So I wanted to talk about this space. Esperanza Spalding, who is a native Portland, she's originally from Portland, is creating this push for an artist sanctuary in here, right here in our town. And so she's been creating this, this ask around folks giving money to make the space a reality. And, you know, there's been so much community support around it, right? Because, you know, one thing that we really were able to highlight last year was the fact that the community is going to do what the community needs to do to address community needs, right? They're going to find spaces and places and ways to hold space and to really create avenues to grieve collectively, or to just come together to do what we do when we experience a loss and we need to be with others. And so she is hosting this and creating spaces like this. And there are countless other artists who are doing work that is similar. Oh, one of my slides is missing. I also had a slide about the Black Feast. This was a project by artists in town, where you're looking at food as a practice of healing and mourning and grief. So you're looking at the ways in which food can be that opiate during that time. And so what they did during last year was they hosted these events where people could just come up and walk away with these bags of like homemade, sometimes vegan foods and treats that really made you feel loved and cared for. And they also included gifts and things from local businesses around town. This is the grant that I was talking about. This is a grant that the group that several groups are applying for right now. The deadline is Friday, June 11th. And this is an opportunity for folks who are trying to create grieving and healing events in Portland to take advantage of funding to make these spaces possible, because they're so important to our collective healing, to our collective remembrance, and our collective understanding of how we need to continue to push our city and our society forward, right? I want to talk about the movement for Black art gathering in diasporic Repast that is happening this Sunday, May 30th in Peninsula Park from 12 to 3. So as I said before, since November, I've been working with a collective of Black artists who have now called themselves a movement for Black art. And their mission is to support Black art by Black artists for the Black community. And this event is about the diasporic tradition that exists in the Black community around grief and mourning. So usually a repast is something that happens when somebody from your community dies, and people show up to the family members of that person who has passed home, and they bring food and libations, and people gather around to talk about, you know, how much they're going to miss that person, of course, and how sometimes untimely that death might have been, but they also gather around to laugh and to share in their glory points and the joy that that person was, how blissful it was to have gotten to know them, how much that person meant to you and to your community, and to really hold a space for that family to grieve and feel supported. And so we're hosting this space in a public space to really, but it's meant to still be very intimate, to have artists come out and, you know, perform. There'll be singers, people who are going to rap, people who are going to dance, people who are going to, there's going to be somebody who's going to speak to this diasporic tradition and pour libations and go through the ritual that is grief and mourning, and take up space in the built environment and show, much like what Harold was saying, how we can transform spaces that were not intended to be these community grieving spaces, but transform them into those spaces, even if just for a few hours. I want to go back to this slide and talk about a little bit more about what we really envision for how we can transform the spaces that already exist in our city to these spaces that people feel welcome. I talked about how I love to go into nature because when I'm in grief and mourning, but the outdoors, and many people go to the outdoors when they are feeling, dealing with the weight of a loss of a loved one or the loss of a community member. But the outdoors are not always a welcoming space for people of color. There has been a lot of, you know, reckoning around the outdoors, especially last year when that's all we had, when we weren't able to go to bars and restaurants and things like that, but our only solace and refuge was being outdoors. You know, a lot of groups were talking about the ways in which people of color are threatened when they're outdoors, are having really disparaging experiences when they are trying to access nature. And it is imperative for all of us to ensure that when we are in these spaces, that we're not alienating people of color, that we're not making it so that people don't feel safe going, you know, taking up space on our trails and taking up space in our the beauty that is Oregon. One of the policies, and when I was talking about the bridges between mourning and policy, one of the policies that the governor was able to enact during the pandemic was trying to mitigate some of the fees, like the camping fees and the park permits and things like that, for folks to be able to access nature in a more equitable manner, right? And that is something that we have been working on in the Racial Justice Council, is not just only thinking about these larger, huge issues like police reform and economic justice and housing reform and all of these things, but also how do we create the space for people to live fully liberated lives, and how do we create the space for folks to be able to access the public goods and the assets in our public commons? So not only in the built environment and in our cities where there's more visibility, but also in these spaces where it can already feel kind of nerve-wracking to go out and hike and camp and fish. But how do we create the space for folks to be here and to be able to have the full tapestry of the human experience in our great outdoors? I just want to go back to this slide and really I really wish that we could have more youth, the elementary school students do this, because I love when they too have to deal with grief, right? And it's not something that sometimes people talk to younger folks about, right? But they're living in our communities and feeling the impacts of seeing people close to their age, like Adam Toledo, who was 13 years old, or Tamir Rice, who was 11, or that young girl who was murdered in her home, sleeping on the couch, right? Akilah Jeffries. And so how do we, create community space for grief and mourning for young people? What does that look like for them? How do we hold space for them and take them through the process? Because the sooner we do that, the more equipped they will be to handle it when it happens to them as adults. So many times we don't have the language or the verbiage or the spaces to show them how to confront grief or to teach how to deal with a tragic loss. And this is something that we have to think about. So when we think about what would our community space for grief and mourning look like, what would our community space for grief and mourning look like centered for children, young people under the age of 16? So I'm going to stop there and invite us to have conversation around that topic specifically. What would it look like to hold space for younger people and to have them understand and grapple with the untimely death that they are also witnessing? How do we do that for them as well?
Yeah. Hi, Akasha. I was actually in the YouTube stream and I popped in here to partake. So I really appreciate your presentation. On a personal level, I lost the woman who raised me during the pandemic. And so I'm in the process of going through grief. And I noticed that grief manifests in the body as fear. And can you speak to the importance of movement and maybe ritual? And how do you see those as part of these environments?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Shelby. I appreciate being vulnerable with us here. Like I said, I think that's a great question in terms of how do we see movement, right? I'm not somebody who likes exercise. I never have been. I've been averse to it. And I found that after my mom passed, I picked up a running practice because being in your body helped me to not, deal with or constantly go over the unanswered questions, like what could I have done? What should we have done? Shouldn't we have noticed? Because her death was really untimely. I spoke to her the morning and then I went to work and got a phone call that she had passed, and so she wasn't sick to our knowledge and nobody knew. And so for me, it was like, could I have seen these warning signs? Like what, and so you're doing that constantly. And so it was like, well, how do I stay present, right? How do I stop trying to think about what my past actions could have been because I can't change what happened, right? And so I think for me, running and going to nature, I went to Forest Park a lot alone and just walking through those forests and being in that tree canopy really just helped to ground me. And really helped me to find clarity and became a meditative space. And so I think finding that space to do that and to get into your body and stop intellectualizing it, because you can't intellectualize it sometimes. It's just something, and but it's a very human thing, right? We all go through it at some point. We're all gonna know loss at some point. And so I don't know if I'm really answering your question fully, but movement is incredibly important. And when we think about young people, right, and like how we would create a space for grief and mourning for them, I think movement would have to be included in that. Like Mo talked about having a meditative practice, right? before we went on live. And like when he feels anxious or nervous, he goes up to the attic and meditates. So teaching kids how to get into the body, how to sit in silence, how to be uncomfortable with the fear that you have, right? How to sit with that is so incredibly important. And it's a part of our mental health practices. And that's where I think art and mental health can come into play, because it helps even an art practice, like moving your arm to create and to paint and to really just, that can be a meditative experience as well. So all of that. Tell me if I missed the part of I feel like I missed a part of your question.
No, I think that was great. I've also been interested in ritual and creating new types of rituals that can be shared with others. I think especially because we have been isolated and separated, like, from pockets of support, and figuring out how to reintroduce new rituals. And yeah, so you answered the question perfectly. So
I was thinking, Shelby, in relationship to your question, and Akasha, also some of your thoughts about processing grief outside or through movement, and then also trying to think about how we might build and honor these kinds of experiences for young people too. It occurs to me in a lot of ways that routine and ritual have strong relationships to one another. And in the setting of a place like a school, for example, one thing that kids do every day is recess. But it's never really categorized as a place of healing, or, it's just sort of thought of as like, this is the one play break that they get. And I wonder if there might be opportunities, also touching on what Harold offered earlier about renaming or calling it different things at different times, so that people can begin to attach movement to processing emotions. And I know there's a lot of work that happens around that within building spaces, within architectures, if you will, Akasha. But I'm thinking about these exterior spaces also as architectures, or not just the built environment, but the natural environment that we are able to interact with, that's part of or encapsulated by a built environment like a school. So I think it's one of those things. I think a lot of us, when we've had intense moments of grieving, we tend to turn inward in some ways, and then also need to move, like we physically try to move to help ourselves move through it. And instead of discovering that as sort of like an after, I love when Akasha's like, I hate exercise, but not so much anymore, right? It's like when it can function for you in a way that makes sense and moves you emotionally, it shifts, it becomes something different. So I wonder if there are opportunities there with kids. We almost dismiss play as something childish or only for, right, a certain time and place. But play can actually be quite serious too. And I was kind of wondering how those things could kind of come together. And I'm sorry.
I think you already made the connection. I think you did it. Like it's really just like you said. I think, and to Harold's point, naming things is so powerful, right? And it's another reason why we have to name this grief that we all have been in for the last year, to be honest, right? Like I think about, my dad and my family who still lives in New York, and they still think about the trauma that happened when you heard sirens going off 24 hours a day because you knew people were struggling to breathe and literally fighting for their lives in this virus. And that compounded with, the police brutality that we saw last year, and saying Breonna Taylor's name and looking for justice through George Floyd. I think there was so much weight put on that because there has been so much grief and so much mourning that we have not been able to see, to find closure in, right? And those marches last summer were a place of solace for folks, right? Like people needed to come together to do that work. So that movement of coming together, or even laying together, right? Like one of the images that I put up there was people laying together, people laid together on that bridge, right? Like there's just something about that collective coming together around something that creates healing, that creates a space where we can move through something that seems incredibly difficult, and like we can't, like insurmountable, right? It seems like we can't get through it. And so I think what you're talking about with renaming recess or adding a recess that is specifically for this, right? So like they have the free time where they do whatever it is they want to do, but there's another time that is a therapeutic healing process whereby they are working out emotions. It's the same thing where teachers say, oh, I need my class to have at least 15 minutes because they're just going to be pent up and they're not going to listen, right? It's the same thing. You have to move these emotions through you and out into the world so that you can process them, right? So I am all for, if there are any administrators listening, adding a healing recess that can be facilitated by, professionals who help young people with moving energy. There's so many ritual practices, and Shelby, you were talking about this, ritual practices in different cultures. There's Qigong, right? That's all about moving energy, right? And so how do you help young people incorporate that into their practice right now and show them that it's not just sitting still and torturing yourself with the emotions you feel, but you can literally move that energy through you and through the environment with these practices that have been around for millennia.
It's really making me think a lot about the Repast project that'll be happening this Sunday at Peninsula Park. And in the context of having experienced so much loss and isolation, at least for my family and within Black culture, that's something that happens when there's a loss and there's a funeral. The repast is what we do after. And I think a lot of, I experienced those so often as a little kid. And part of that for us as children was play and understanding that remembering somebody was also about eating and laughing and seeing your aunties and your uncles and your extended family. I mean, there's a lot of love there too. So it's like this place of intense mourning that's also infused with an intense amount of love. And as kids, we were like everybody's kids in those moments. You listen to whoever. It was a different formation and way that the family felt specific to those moments, while people were both comforting and feeding. And I mean, there's a lot of food, specific food too. And I just think about what happens when we don't get to have those opportunities. So like my family member, I have a few family members that I lost in COVID, where we couldn't have the ritual experiences of togetherness that we might have had otherwise. And sort of the double layer of trauma that causes. So it's really making me think about what it means now in the aftermath of how much we've all gone through in so many different ways in the past year. How we don't wait 50, 75 years for a monument to be built that is a static place. And many of the people that have had the experience have now just had to process the grief in any way. But how we can have things in real time that might be more ephemeral or more regular or more, the word accessible is starting to become almost a trope, but in the way that I mean it, right? A way for us to kind of enter into these things more immediately, and recognize that there's a need for that permanence is not sort of the marker of value, right? The impermanence is sort of also a fact of life or change, as Octavia.
And how much, like, you can't find a better analogy to the impermanence of life than death, right? And so it's like to have to wait, like 50 years for a monument or the RFP and the building and the it's too static. We need something that is more malleable, more responsive, more ephemeral, like you said. So it's just like, how do we do that? How do we actually create space for that? Yeah, I love that. Thank you, Lisa.
As Lisa was talking, it just kind of reminded me of how grief is not somewhere people like to linger. They like to pass through. And I think they're, through all of this and kind of working through my own grief, I'm realizing that to create it or to claim a space in the public realm that allows for people to address or to dedicate to their grieving process, but also to move forward to have some kind of mindfulness, but then be able to move forward is important. I think that grief isn't supposed to be stagnant. And that's why you were talking about the impermanence. Like, it's supposed to be flowing to allow that to go where it needs to be. So I just realized, especially when talking with people, you know, they can sympathize in a certain realm, but it is not a conversation that people like to linger within. And yeah, I'm interested in that. And how can the public realm hold this conversation when we are a nation, people more so than others that are grieving. And can we be compassionate enough within our environment to really dedicate space to that without it being kind of like dismissive or creating a pocket away from the hustle and bustle of society. Yeah.
I completely understand that, Shelby, and I thank you for that. It's very true that when you're the one going through the grief and the mourning, that you're trying to connect with people on it, and their first response is to try to make you not think about it, right? And to make you feel better. But sometimes the opiate that you're looking for is to process it, right? And to move through it. And so, yeah, it's something we don't talk about enough. And so that's why we need to have these spaces and think about it in this context. And I didn't tell you guys what I was going to talk about today, but I'm glad that, you know, you're so receptive to it, and that we're creating this space for young people to also process it and to maybe have a conversation with their parents about what they've been feeling. And they haven't had the opportunity or the ability to verbalize it yet. And this can serve as that jumping off point.
Thank you, everyone, for this conversation. Akasha, we actually love to be in discussion, so we appreciate anything that sort of shifts us from what we're used to experiencing. That's very much our style. So thank you for bringing your presence and your voice to the room today. We have just a few more minutes. Is there anything that you'd like to share out with our audience about the work that you're doing in the world, this new role that you're sort of exploring?
Oh yeah, that. Yeah, I mean, you know, I really feel called to do the work that I do, right? I've been a practitioner of the built environment. I've now a small business owner who helps, you know, small businesses own their own commercial real estate as a pathway to creating generational wealth. Everything that I do is, you know, really around this one mission, and that is to enable folks to live fully liberated lives. And for me, that looks like, at the very least, having your basic needs met. Because how can you, it's much harder, there are always exceptions to the rule, but it's much harder to dream and to live your purpose when you don't have adequate housing, when you are living in a tent and don't know where your next shower is going to come from, or your food is going to come from, or how, or you know, and this is something I'm going to talk about tonight, or, you know, I have a neighbor who lives across the street in a tent. His name is John, and he's over 65, and he has been diagnosed most recently with prostate cancer. And so now he's going to have to battle cancer from a tent. And I just can't imagine that. In and of itself is a level of grief and mourning, right? Because he's looking at the fact that he does not have the resources to, or the community to get through that devastating illness alongside him. And I'm trying to make phone calls like, how can we, you know, and everybody is overrun. There is such an incredible need that he can't even move up the list with his age and his cancer and his housing situation. That is not enough to move him up the list, because there are people in his identical situation and worse. And so for me, it's like, we can't even get to a place where everybody is fully actualized and living purposefully and intentionally when people, Warm Springs didn't have running water during the pandemic, you know? So I just invite folks to constantly think beyond yourself and what is happening in your daily life, even if what's happening is really rough, and look to how do we support the collective us, you know? How do we turn all of our trials into triumphs? And so that's essentially a teaser for the speech that I'm going to give tonight at my campaign kickoff. And I'm running for Senate District 18, which is, you know, downtown Portland, Northwest, Southwest Portland, all the way to Tigard. And, you know, really with that message of we need economic justice, we need people's basic needs met. But more than anything else, we need for everybody collectively to want a better us, you know, and to do the work to make that happen. So I thank you guys. It's 11 o'clock on the dot. I thank you all for your time and for inviting me and for the questions that we didn't always get to, but I think I kind of touched on that last one in that last tidbit. And thank you again. I really appreciate holding space with you guys.
Akasha, thank you so much. Great luck. Good luck tonight. We look forward to seeing how your work continues to grow and to continuing to work with you in the future. To our students out there from the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. community, thank you for being with us on our YouTube live stream. And we hope to see you all again next week at the same time. That's 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, where we will hear from Recess. That's Jordan Rosenblum and Kimberly Sutherland about graphic design in relationship to KSMoCA. So thank you, everybody. Have a really nice week. Akasha, thank you so much.